Welcome to Open Minds, a Freedom of Thought podcast series, interviewing the people who bring courage and independent thought to the challenges of today.
Hello, this is Todd Zywicki. I'm here on today's Open Mind podcast, and I am thrilled to be here with the great Richard Epstein, law professor extraordinaire, probably along with F.A. Hayek, the single most greatest intellectual influence on my own thinking and career and life. And so I am really thrilled to have Richard with us today to talk about his ideas and his intellectual evolution. Richard, thanks for being here.
Oh, it's a great pleasure.
Well, Richard, according to a recent survey I saw, you're the fifth most cited law professor, legal scholar of all time, narrowing out Oliver Wendell Holmes by at least 5,000 citations, who is a distant sixth. But that's sort of the end of the story. I want to go back to the beginning of this story. And I think our listeners would be really thrilled. I know I would be interested to hear how a good little Jewish boy from Brooklyn ended up as the leading classical liberal thinker of his era, certainly in legal studies and maybe more generally. So why don't we start at the beginning, and if you want to talk a little bit about your background. Sure. And whether you were always kind of a classical liberal or libertarian. Did you get that from your parents, or sort of what was your early experience?
Let's start with the parents, right? I was born in Brooklyn in April 1943. My father was an eminent radiologist, and my mother ran the office. And my first understanding of my parents is that the office was downstairs, and I could still remember my father charging upstairs in his white coat for a quick lunch. And it turns out I was a case, arguably, of arrested development in the sense that they had much less time than normal to talk to me. And I started to be somewhat of a late talker. I was also somewhat of a kind of a difficult person, and I would say that most of my family relatives had grim predictions for my future fate. The only exception was my grandpa Abraham, my mother's father, but he unfortunately died when I was 5.5, so I lost my primary advocate. And I was always a curious kid. My nickname when I went on the school bus to Broad Channel Gay Camp starting at 3 was called Lid Flipper. Don't ask me why. But I kept on bouncing up and down and doing one thing after another. And as I finally made it into first grade, I had two kinds of teachers. One of them said, "Oh, he's a very smart boy and would try to teach me something." And others would say, "He's a very undisciplined boy. I wish he wouldn't keep spilling the ink out of the inkwell," which is the kinds of things that we used at that time. And I could still remember at least one occasion in which I spilled the ink so badly that I had spent 45 minutes to clean it all up. I was a klutz then. I'm a klutz now. Nothing much in that regard has changed. But I had some teachers who kind of, at that early age, did something to me for which I'm still grateful. Of course, you can't repay them, right? But you try to do it by teaching the next generation. My first and second grade teacher, Miss Litwin, was always extremely nice, and she knew that I had some math talent, and she tried to develop one-on-one. And one of the things that she had me do was to tutor some of the other kids on the fundamentals. And, you know, by tragedy about my math education, it was basically relatively undistinguished until I was 12th grade. And by that time, I was a competent math student, but nothing special. And then there was Mr. Greenberg, who was my 6th grade teacher, who taught us how to sing, and essentially was the teacher I had when Brown v. Board came out, and that was just a couple of weeks after Roger Bannister ran the 4-minute mile. And he was always somebody with a kind of prophetic vision, and all of that stuff kind of rubs on you. And so the way in which you sort of describe your young life is that you're never going to be the same person as the people who influence you. Indeed, I've spent my entire life trying to avoid having any kind of a mentor because it's just too much control. But you try to pick up a bit from this one or back from somebody else and put them together in line with your own personality. And I had many teachers at that level who did that. It was also true in junior high and senior high school. I had teachers who did the same thing. Miss Feldman was a wonderful 9th grade English teacher, right? And I still remember the way in which we learned all about Ivanhoe. And then my Mr. Fabric, my 10th grade teacher, was exactly the opposite. But when it comes to the Tale of Two Cities, I still remember on page 37 or whatever it was, that what the Monseigneur drank for breakfast was chocolate. And then there was Madame Defarge and all the rest of that stuff. And my teacher in my last year was a man named Franklin W. Watson, or I think it was W. And he had been at Brown, and he introduced me to sort of philosophy, which gets you much closer to home. And the book that he picked on was one of the great books of the time. It was the Mentor series on the Age of Enlightenment, and the introduction was written by Isaiah Berlin. And Berlin was just absolutely a magnetic kind of writer. He's known for 4 or 5 things that he's written, one thing or another, but big ideas and small ideas, foxes and hedgehogs and so forth, historical inevitability and so forth. But for me, none of that was important. This is the man who opened up the portal to the British empiricists and the way in which they started to think. And, from the very beginning, I had the following view, that these guys are onto something really big and really good, but it never struck me as quite right. There was always pieces that seemed to be missing on this, and that was also true of Berlin's work. I was, even at the age of 11, 12, certainly by 16 and 17, interested in some kind of a synoptic theory. I didn't even know what that theory would be or how it would develop, but that was always my mental and intellectual inclination. What about my academic propensities? Well, most people think that I was just weird. I did come from a medical family. My father was a physician, but he was also a writer. And I actually remember eating liver in the kitchens. My father would be off with a great man named Leo Davidoff, writing a book on the abnormal pneumoencephalogram, which I'm quite happy to describe to you if you want to learn about sadistic treatments for understanding the way in which the brain is exercised. So people said to me, well, later on, when did you think that you wanted to be an academic? I said, probably when I was about 11. And I said, academic? I said, yes, I didn't want to be a high school teacher or an elementary school teacher. I wanted to be a professor. And that is a kind of a very strange way in which to sort of run your life. But it never was anything else that I really wanted to do in life. And I'm still not quite sure, but I was always fascinated with the fact that there were 10 ideas on the table, and you could get 8 of them to fit quite comfortably, but those other pesky 2 didn't seem to fit in. And the last 2 turned out to be why I ceased being a pure libertarian and became some kind of a classical libertarian. Needed a broader theory to take into account a lot of disturbing facts and arguments that you knew were correct, but you couldn't explain within your own theory. And so I went to college, and I was, again, extremely fortunate in having good teachers and the way in which they did it. And, I still remember instances of things that happened, 60-odd years ago, which kind of shaped the way in which I thought about all of this stuff. I'll just give one of the instances right now. I was a student of Ernest Nagel, and this was in 1962. I took a class in philosophy of law, and the book that we read was just out, was H.L.A. Hart, The Concept of Law. And, we sort of talked about it, and I was always kind of troubled by it. I couldn't quite figure out how he distinguished himself, even at that age, from Kelsen, and there's a story to that. And moreover, it turned out that he tried to do law. He tried to do law. That was somebody calling me who I don't want to answer. He tried to do law as a kind of a formal and substantive inquiry, where the substantive stuff was not part of his essential commitment. And if you go to the back of the book, he has a section on the minimum content of natural law. And it's not so minimal, as I wrote about this some 40 years later. And he always tried to do what most sort of Austinian and English lawyers did, have a core of natural law that they then cab into a very, very narrow area. And I didn't see how it was that particular system worked. So even when I had Professor Nagel, I was just deeply troubled about the lack of a synthetic arrangement by a teacher who himself was more of a facts and circumstance man with respect to legal history than I was. Well, anyhow, one of the seminal events in my life was he thought well enough of me as a student that he did something which was largely unheard of at Columbia. He had me come to a faculty workshop and just sit in the back of the room. You have to remember, at Columbia at that time, there were the officers, they were above the line, and then there were the enlisted men down below the line, and never the twain should meet. And he took me to this thing. It was a talk given by a logician named Charlie Parsons, whose father was Talcott Parsons, who was very famous for the structure of social action, a book which I think was very important at the time, but in retrospect kind of dated and outdated, I think, in some sense. And I'm sitting there listening to this in utter disbelief. I can't believe how misguided the whole thing seemed to me. And after over, Nagel was just savage. He looked at me, and what he said was, "I'm so annoyed." He said, "We managed to straighten these things out back in 1930 to 1935. And the history of philosophy since that time is unlearning what we had solved." And so I looked at him and said, what do you say? He said, and he told me, he said, well, you want to go into philosophy? I said, don't know. He says, well, if you could do what Paul Cohen did, he was a famous logician who did one famous thing in his lifetime, but it puts him with the immortals. And I said, no, I don't want to prove the decidability theory. Indeed, I'm taking a course with a man named Van Eyenoort on mathematical logics, and I couldn't do the math, but somehow or other, when I read what Alonzo Church wrote about the ordinary language stuff, it just seemed to me to be wrong. And I realized that that's where my peculiar strength lay, in figuring out how to do verbal translations and approximations of mathematical notions in a way that try to preserve their intellectual integrity. So anyhow,
well, let's
that's the second element.
Yeah, we'll come back to that later.
But so Nagel said, I said, I can't do that stuff. And so he said, look, I have a friend named Charlie Breitel, and that's Charles Breitel, who later became a quite distinguished and thoughtful member of the New York State Court of Appeal, and so forth. And I teach a seminar with him over at the law school. And as far as I'm concerned, you're better off going that route than you are staying inside a philosophy department. And so I thought about it, and I said, oh, what he's telling me is I can take the back channel and get back into political philosophy without going through the degree. Now, at Columbia, this was a serious issue. One of the reasons why you had the riot in 1968 at Columbia, well, the obvious reason was that Columbia lost in the first round of the NCAA finals to Davidson. But the second reason was that it ran on essentially a hierarchical structure in which they had very low peons called instructors and below that preceptors or something. And the basic theorem was, if you had a student who was about ready to get his PhD, don't read the thesis so you could keep him in line for another year. Right. And so going to Columbia meant that there was a whole cadre of instructors who were deeply resentful of the way in which they had been exploited and abused with no real option. And so when I went to law school, I was past all of that stuff. I did something which was completely unconventional. What I decided to do was to go to Oxford, but to study law.
Before we get your law, let's take a quick step back and go back earlier in time. So you're going through high school. Your dad was a radiologist. Were you, and obviously you were very bright, precocious, interested in other things. Did you think in political terms at that point? Were you, you said you kind of started off as a libertarian.
No, I mean.
Did that come later?
As a theory, it came later. In fact, I first realized.
Because most Brooklyn Jews in that era would have been communists.
No, I was
which
not.
Obviously you are not, and probably your dad and mom weren't either. So.
Yeah, well, no, they were New Deal children in some sense. Okay. But essentially the kind of defining adventures of that time were much more pragmatic. It was Uncle Sammy and Uncle Albert. And both of them had businesses in New York City. Right. And it turns out that they couldn't do business with the labor unions. And so one went to York, Pennsylvania. The other went somewhere else outside the city. Tulsa, Oklahoma, I think, in part. And I began to realize that somehow or other this was not a sensible way to do things. And then I asked reasons as to why all this happened. And it was a combination of unresponsive physical plant. These stores were on two levels, and we were trying to run a production line. It doesn't work. And then there were the constant political issues associated with the union. So what happened is I was kind of a skeptic rather than a libertarian. Yep. And I remember listening to the 1960 presidential election, being charmed like everybody else by John F. Kennedy, but not quite persuaded by it. So I wouldn't have called myself a Republican at that particular point in time. I had read by that time the stuff about Locke and Hume, but it wasn't quite that I put all the dots together. By the time I got to college and started reading this stuff.
So you went to college about what year?
Yeah, I entered 1960, and I went to Columbia as a shadow of its former self. But when I went there, it was a great place. And, what do you remember? Well, you go in there and you have freshman orientation. And the strategy of Columbia was to take all the great professors and parade them in front of you. Gilbert Hayes, Modus Hattis, and Jacques Barzone, whatever it was. And so we had a book to read for the orientation period called The Two Disciplines or so forth by E.P. Snow. And this was both a novelist on the one hand and a scientist on the other. And the great question that we had to ask is how you could reconcile, if at all, the two kinds of expertises that he had. Well, that's exactly the kind of question that you want to ask when you're a freshman. It is about political theory in some sense, but it's not about politics. The politics, of course, was that John Kennedy lost to Nixon, and there was an appropriate amount of horror and disappointment in New York City about that. Remember, the Nixon of the 1950s was not regarded as an admirable figure in many ways. My little dog checkers and so forth. Eisenhower basically, you didn't know whether he liked them, was just acquiescing to him and so forth. And so that was it. But I then started to take more serious courses. And, it's all depending on your teachers. I had a man who recently passed away named David Sidorsky. He was not a great scholar, but he was a great teacher. And, what do you think? I could still remember his lectures on the Theaetetus, which I heard in the fall of 1962. And then we read Discourse on the Methods by Descartes, and then we read the Ethics of G.E. Moore and so forth. These were important books.
But you weren't studying economics during this period.
There's no economics whatsoever.
So that all comes later. Okay.
So
you were going through here, and then eventually you get directed towards law school.
Yeah, I could explain that too. I was doing political.
Well, you get directed toward Oxford. Yeah. I'm sorry,
I'll get to that. Okay, but I mean, what happened is when you were sitting there at that particular age, you have teachers who were very powerful, like Nagel and Daniel Bell and so forth.
Yeah.
Neither of them were economists, and that was kind of the missing piece. I never took an undergraduate course in economics. I did sit in from time to time in a course taught by William Vickery, who won the Nobel Prize and died at the toll booth going up to Massachusetts, so he could never claim it. And it did have some influence on that, but that was not essentially my dominant way of thinking about the subject matter. It's not that I was hostile to economics. Essentially, I was not part of that particular tradition. Mm-hmm. Well, then there was the question about where I go to law school. And I had a very distinct view about this subject. I said, if you want to be an academic, you need a very broad base. And I thought going to England and studying Roman law, which was the right call, and English legal history and stuff, would really make a big difference when I came back to the United States.
So that was your idea, to think of Roman and not directed by somebody at Columbia.
And not only that, and not taking PPP in England.
Right.
Well, I mean, I wanted to go to law school. Right. And then I will tell you the conversation, which still sticks in my craw mildly. So we have a pre-law session, and the instructor from the law school came over. It was a man named Monrad Paulson, Kadish and Paulson, right, the criminal law guy. And these people were starting to ask questions about law school and this, that, and the other thing. And about 3/4 of the way through the session, I raised my hand, and I asked the following question. I said, if you want to become a law professor, what should you do? Do you want me to quote the answer?
Yes.
Because it's word for word. It's only 61 years ago. He said, first you go to Harvard, Yale, and Columbia. Then you finish first in your class. Then you become editor-in-chief of the law review. Then you clerk for the Supreme Court. And then, young man, you could ask me that question. That is a direct quote. I was absolutely poleaxed by that. I mean, I couldn't believe that anybody could be so dumb. All I wanted him to say, well, read Oliver Wendell Holmes' The Common Law. Right. I mean, I didn't want him to guarantee me admission. But what I realized, strangely enough, afterwards is that's a formula for mediocrity. What you really need to do is to be much more independent and much more intellectually inventive. Finishing first in the class may or may not matter. I did go to Yale and to Oxford. I didn't clerk on the Supreme Court. I barely made it onto the law review. But I was much more intellectually energized than most of the people who had done those things. And it turns out the real question about becoming an academic is, could you figure out how to make the transformation from being a very dutiful and excellent student to being somebody who's capable of doing original work?
Right.
And that's the lesson that became perfectly clear to me, even when I was asking him that question. And so I said to myself, the last thing I want to do is to fit into a formula where all that I do proves that I have earned the approval and adulation of my faculty members. I want to see if I could kind of strike off on my own way. And so what I did is, I did get a scholarship. It wasn't the Rose. It wasn't the Marshall. It was a Kellett Scholarship. So I go for an interview for the Marshall Scholarship. And, I had a very strong record. And I put down, I will go to Oxford or I will go to Cambridge to law school, when the instructions explicitly said you could only put down one of the two, and then you have to put down a white brick or a red brick. So I go into the meeting, and they say, you're not allowed to do this. I said, yes, I am, because I will not take a Marshall Scholarship if I have to do philosophy, because they'd asked me whether I'd go to Brit School, which was at the time an excellent department. I said, no, I don't care about the degree as much. I mean, they kind of looked at me kind of wonky-eyed. Why is this guy basically killing his chances for the scholarship? But it was because I knew I was going to get a scholarship from Columbia, and that would allow me to study law. I didn't know whether I'd go to Oxford or Cambridge. I ended up at Oriel College, Oxford, and where I had the great fortune of having first Alan Watson as a teacher, who became kind of famous as the transformation guy, and then Bernard Rutten. They were my two major tutors. And I learned different things from both of them. But the most important thing I learned was to figure out how to do law by yourself.
And that's the way they do it in Oxford.
Yes, one-on-one tutorials. But it was a very unusual set of circumstances because, A, I didn't know what most Englishmen knew. But on the other hand, I was taken a number of graduate courses in philosophy and so forth. And so I had to take jurisprudence. I took it with a man named John Ekelar, a young tutor coming out of, I think it was then Rhodesia, into Pembroke College. And we became kind of friends. And 30 years later, when I talked to him, he said, I have to tell you, every time you walked into my office for one of these tutorials, I really got a case of the willies. I had never dealt with anybody like you. But he hadn't. I mean, it was, look, we were the same age. I was maybe a year younger than him. But I had done graduate work in philosophy, and he was just a very smart guy. And it turned out he was a very distinguished scholar and a fine gentleman. But it was a very atypical mix. When you went there.
Were any of these tutors experts in Roman law? Or
Watson was the Roman lawyer.
He was the Roman lawyer.
But look, I mean, it started out, I can't begin to tell you what a catastrophe it was. Because what happened is I took the second course in Roman law. The first course in Roman law was taught in the first examinations, which was for 2 quarters. The second part was 7 quarters of instruction, but the Americans had to cram it into 6. So I had not had the first Roman course when I took the second Roman course. And the high point of my first tutorial, this I remember because of the acute embarrassment that it caused, is we talked about stipulations and acceptolatios, and I thought an acceptolatio was like an offer and acceptance. No. An acceptolatio is a release as a kind of a converse situation to the formation. And so there's Professor Watson, very learned, looking at me in disbelief how anybody could mess up something so badly on this stuff. And well, the reason I did it is I knew a little Latin. I didn't know that. But what happened is I got attracted to Roman law for reasons that were not the reasons that our friend Watson had. Watson was, in fact, a genius at one thing. He did by far the best translation of the Digest. I mean, all 4 volumes about that. And he had done a huge amount of work on the history of Roman law in the early Roman Republic, that is roughly before Caesar and Octavius and all the rest of that stuff, is what he knew. But he wasn't a structuralist. And
what did you mean by that?
I mean, well, I looked at the Roman law and I said, well, why is it that you have rules for stipulatio, which are unilateral contracts, as opposed to use for sale, which are bilateral contracts? And well, why do you put that together and how do you put it together? And so forth. Or why do you have 3 different kinds of guarantees instead of only one kind of guarantee? And why is it that they don't allow you to vary the term?
And he approached it purely as a
historical matter. And the dominant pattern at Oxford at that time was to make sure that you could detect an interpolation in the text by getting a sense of the grammar and the mood. That was the 19th century writer. I mean, those guys read Latin. They didn't read a foreign language. They read Latin as well as they read English in terms of everything they did. And so just as you could pick up an awkwardness in an English text, they could pick it up in a Latin text. But I did not want to spend my time making sure that the interpolations were correct. So the man who essentially inspired the larger view was a man named David Dalber. And Dalber was a German refugee. He came to there. He written a very famous article on Lex Aquilia about the word erit and fuit. Is it past or is it future when you're talking about damages to animals that are alive? He was an exceptional tutor, not a tutor, a lecturer. And so I used to go to his lectures, and I also went to H.L.A. Hart's lectures at that time. And the tradition at Oxford was professors lecture, but you can't talk. And so you just sit there and listen. But that's okay. And, they had a huge influence on my life in terms of the way in which it thought. But it was in a kind of a different way. It was, God, I think you did great things, but there's something missing in all of this. And I said, I couldn't quite get it. Dalber was more of a structuralist than Hart. But Hart, for example, there were 2 things that I remember about his lectures. Once he tried to apply the theory of causation that works pretty well in Tort's case to the law of contract, and he confessed he couldn't make any sense of it. Well, why didn't he make sense of it? Because the dominant issue is not contract. In contract, it's not causation. The dominant issue in contract There's ex-ante agreements to maximize joint welfare.
Right.
And what you do is you tend to allocate losses one way or another. But causation is strictly derivative upon the way in which you allocate these losses. And it turns out that the essential feature in contract law for consequential damages is to figure out when the expectation measure works and when it doesn't work. And nobody wanted to talk about those issues. And it took me some time to get past it when I realized that Hart didn't quite understand it, and he didn't understand antitrust law for the same kind of reasons and so forth.
Now, Hart was substantively a criminal law?
No, he was basically... He did several things.
Other than jurisprudence.
Yeah, well, he started off as a chancery barrister in the 1930s. He was born in 1907. And what happened is he went into the service, and he was a code guy breaker and so forth. He comes out, and he wants to study law, and he's now in his early 40s. And he writes a paper for the Aristotelian Society on prescription and ascriptive rights. The paper's a complete intellectual mess.
Right.
And he later repudiated it. But the important thing is he repudiated it for the wrong reasons. That is, he did not understand why the paper was wrong.
Right.
And what he tried to do is a great mistake that often happens with philosophical types, which is he thought that you could solve a lot of problems by definition, when in fact what you have to solve them is by substantive theory. And so the definition of a contract should not include all excusing and justifying condition. What it is very simply the definition from Pothier, which carried over from the French to the English law. It's an agreement by two people to either perform or abstain from some kind of an act, period. And the question about responsibility is solved in the following way. If, in fact, there's non-performance of a contract, that's a prima facie evidence of breach. And what you discover as you go through the English language, and it carries over to every other known language as well, is you have two sets of words. One is descriptive, and the other turns out to be ultimately judgmental. And so non-performance is one word. The judgmental word is breach, right? And when you start dealing with torts, I mean, it turns out the first word is kill, but the justification word is murder. And what you have to do is to figure out how these words pair up. And the only way in which you can pair them up is you have to figure out how it is that you make the move from one to the other. And you know how you have crossword puzzles, right? And you replace a letter on a chain and you get to the bottom of it with a different word.
Yeah, right.
You know, hot, the cold, or whatever it turns out. Well, that's what you have to do. And when I was fairly early on, I realized that the notion of a presumption became the dominant intellectual tool, and that none of these guys wanted to talk about that as the way in which these things were done, and so that the whole enterprise to some extent was a mistake. The other thing that Hart got wrong, and it was an interesting debate, was the difference between himself and a man named Kelsen. Now, Hans Kelsen is widely forgotten today by most Americans. You've heard of him, right?
Well, Hayek talks about him a lot. So
yes,
that's right. That's the only reason I know.
Yeah, but Kelsen was a very important legal figure who lived, into his 90s. He started writing very early in the 20th century. He wrote his masterpiece on international law in 1945. But earlier on, he tried to figure out what the pure theory of law was and so forth.
Right.
And it was a kind of
this definitional stuff.
Yes. Well, and he got it half right. I mean, what he wanted to do, what's law, is he says, you look at a proposition, thou shalt not kill, is it law? Well, the answer is until you know who pronounced that law, you don't know whether it's law. So you go back to the sovereign problem. If it's the sovereign who pronounces it, and then you need a rule of recognition, then it's a law. But in truing it, you always have to worry about the presumption side. And he was more worried about the authentication side and less worried about the interpretive side. And Hart basically wanted to say his theory was radically different from that of Austin and from that of Hart. And that was the lecture we got in 1964. 1965 comes along, and Hart in the meantime had visited Kelsen at Berkeley, where he then was staying. He came back and said, well, I have to tell those of you who were here last year, I made some very serious mistakes in the way in which I understood Mr. Kelsen. And it was extremely generous of a very eminent guy to come forward and to talk about all his errors. And essentially what happens is the two guys were much more convergent than you might have otherwise had thought, and that the differences between them really did not matter. It's a choice of audience, and it turns out, yes, law is addressed to officials, and yes, law is addressed to the public. They may respond to it in different ways. The public wants to know the basic case and wants to stay out of trouble, and the official has to know all the ins and outs to deal with the hard cases of adjudication before them, but they're both looking at the elephant in slightly different ways. And, it's very important to listen to that. and to learn from that. And I only met Hart once in my life. And I was at a friend named Harvey Whiting, Wieting, who had worked with him. And I was coming back from Oxford, I guess it was in the summer of 1967 or 68, by which time I was already teaching. And I made the terrible, not mistake, but observation. There was a famous man called John Chipman Gray. I think you remember his name, right? Well, he did two things. He wrote a book on the rule against perpetuities with its mathematical formulas, less mathematical than meets the eye, when you understand the number of accommodations they have to do on a non-mathematical basis. And then he wrote another book about the nature and sources of law, which seemed to me to be a book that was much more about the evolution of law with a slightly open-ended, somewhat mysterious situation. So I mentioned it to Hart. I said, I didn't see how these two books were easily reconciled. What a mistake. For the next 30 minutes on that train from Oxford, all he did was to grill me within an inch of my life. And I mean, this was his game, not my turf. I made it as an observation. I wasn't making it as a commitment. But he took it as stuff. And when he got onto a topic, he played winner's keeps. It didn't matter who was on the other side of that thing. And so I got off of that chain more shaken intellectually than I ever was. And then, I don't know if you know this, but I spent a large part of my career building on the Hart and honorary model of causation. But most of the thing is finding out it has very serious internal errors.
So that starts with Hart raising questions of causation.
Yes.
That gets you into the questions.
And I can still remember. Well, of course, he never
cases.
talked about the differences.
Right.
But on page 3 of the book, he made one of the more profound statements. He says, everybody wants to tell you that causation is a matter of policy. And that seems to derive of any coordinate whatsoever. But he says, I will recognize that there are difficult cases, but I want you to understand that they're recognizable cases, and that we don't want to go to the two extremes of saying it means nothing or it means everything. That was on page 3 or something of the book in 1959. The last lecture he gave on the nightmare and the noble dream. I don't know if you know this, but it was in Georgia. The nightmare is thinking you get perfect precision, and the noble, right? Is you can't get any precision, and the noble dream is you could get it right. Yeah, and so he was a guy who was in the middle. Well, the moment you start talking about presumptions, what happens is all of a sudden that becomes perfectly clear that it has to be. Right. What the presumption does is it sets the first stage in an argument, and it probably covers 90% of the cases you do. And then the next level is the magnitude order 2 down. Yep. So what you find out is that the cases of the greatest difficulty are the cases of the lowest frequency, which means, in effect, that you could decide them either way. But so long as the rest of the body is not upset by the way in which you treat cases on the fourth on the fourth marching order, the system is going to be coherent in practice, even though in theory it's going to have these kind of loose ends. And that sort of came to me at that time. What happens is presumptions then lead you into figuring out how you balance. And then once you start to figure out how you have to balance, what it does is it makes you much less of a libertarian than you were. Yep. Because libertarians are always yes-no rules, not balancing rules. But they tend to do that under a very restrictive set of circumstances. Namely, they talk about these kinds of circumstances where the harm is already caused, and the issue is whether you pay or don't pay. What they don't talk about is you don't know whether it's going to happen or not happen, and you cannot use that kind of certitude. Right. So what do? You do what you do and what I do. Two kinds of errors, ladies and gentlemen. Well, that means you have really estimation problems of one kind or another. You don't get that hard-edged rule, but you do have a theory of what you're trying to maximize and minimize, and that's enough to make it into a theory. And so you have to understand, once you understand that point, what happens is you don't become the crazy realist, where anything starts to go. So anyhow, learning all that, I think, was extremely important.
Well, it strikes me also, you mentioned earlier, when you were very early on, when you were talking about Isaiah Berlin, and that you were almost immediately attracted to the British empiricist tradition. Now, Hume, which is very much what influences me as well. And it sounds like many of these same echoes, right? Which is for those of us like you and I who love the common law and are skeptical of sort of libertarian theorizing from first principles,
cautious.
Or describing the way you thought about Roman law structurally and asking these questions. It's very much of an application of sort of the British empiricist tradition of let's see what people are actually doing and figure it out. And hey, it turns out there's kind of logic here.
Yeah, well, let me give you a kind of an example of that. I mean, about the libertarian situation. It turns out if you are a contractual libertarian, all promises are enforceable independent of their content. All you have to do is to prove that the conditions on defeasibility, mistake, frustration, coercion, so forth aren't there.
Right.
So then you get to 1711, and you read a case called Reynolds against Mitchell. This is the case for the audience in which it turns out the English court, when they had a contract for services, said that you could prevent your employee from going off and starting in competition, but there were 3 conditions attached to that.
Right.
It could only be for a year. It could only be for the same products, not new products, and only in the same location. The quintessential balancing test. So I remember asking one of my students who just got a PhD in Kant. I said, what would a Kantian say about the rules on restraint of trade? He didn't know. I said, the first thing he didn't know is in the libertarian system, there is no subcategory of contracts which are in restraint of trade.
Right.
They're all the same. And then you look at this English tradition, and it takes in 1711, but if you go back, you can see traces of it even further. You go forward, you see nobody trying to erase it. You see people trying to qualify.
And when you look back, in 1492, when they struck down covenants not to compete, it was during the Guild era.
Yeah,
right,
and that's another problem.
And so the common law has this ability to adapt to the world around.
And of course, what the interesting thing is, the judges who did it, they were harumph a lot. They couldn't quite give you a formal explanation,
Right.
but they were much more empirical in the sense they looked around at the world and they said, this seems to us to be a bit too much. And so with Roman law and with the early English common law, my early intellectual development, and it's still part of my law, is to say, you got a bunch of rules. They sit very awkwardly with the libertarian tradition. Where's the deviation? And when is it right? And when is it wrong?
Let's come back to that. For this first session, I want to go ahead and get to when you went to law school. You came back from Oxford. You went to law school.
I went to Yale.
And went to Yale.
And now that was a night. No, it was an interesting phenomenon, right? First of all, I had left in 1964 when the Goldwater campaign was up, and I could still remember virtually everyone I knew at the time, perhaps even myself, who said, if he becomes president of the United States, the world is at an end. And well, he lost pretty decisively. And when I get back to Oxford, to Yale, it's a completely different world from what it was when I left in 1964. The change started in 1960. So I'll go back to college just for a little bit. What was the tradition for freshmen coming into Columbia in 1960? We all wore blue beanies for the first several weeks of classes. Light blue with a white C on top of it. And you could see us all over the campus with our beanies. The next year, half the class wore beanies. The third year, nobody wore beanies and so forth. And so that all of the kind of collective traditions that you had, committing yourself to a common form of scholarship, were essentially removed from the way in which we worked. I didn't think much of it at the time, but as I think back to it, the beanie world was better than the non-beanie world, because what happened in 1963? People weren't wearing beanies anymore. They were wearing SDS flags or things. I mean, they really were extremely systematic, and you could watch this thing kind of disintegrate in front of your eye. Right. So you go off and you see Kennedy had just been killed. You see it come back 2 years later. And
wow.
This is now the dominant ethos at every place that you could find.
Right.
And, well, it was very hard to fit in because by that time I was a common law libertarian. Mm-hmm. That is, the way English education worked, is the only thing you studied really was common law. You had one course in administrative law, and this is basically what the course was. It's different now in England, is that the courts do not interfere with Parliament or its committees. Right. Very short course that you had to have. And so I remember somebody wrote a letter to the judges saying, I think my examination in administrative law was misgraded, and I hope that you guys will intervene to correct it. And the answer came back, the very fact that you have brought this lawsuit proves to us that the grade was fully justified. But that was the tradition. And my teacher was a man named D.G.T. Williams, who was kind of a little bit out of that tradition.
And this was at Yale?
No, he was at Keble College, okay. And then he later became a fairly distinguished guy at Cambridge. He left Oxford. But he sort of had some doubt. The major issue was a real estate issue. It was a case called Stevenage, and it had to do with the green belt that was put around London. I don't know if you know what the green belt is, but you think of this as Central Park going all the way around, and there are massive prohibitions against construction within the area. And so the question is, what kind of attack could you raise on the greenbelt? And think of this as kind of like Euclid also. Right. And the answer was only the pettiest of procedural kinds of objections, and the whole thing continued to go because everybody thought that the model of civil servants with degrees in Latin and geometry were the people to decide the fate of the Union. Right. And so it was their version of the German Research University, their version of Woodrow Wilson saying, we understand all these common law rules are just an impediment against us great mind. Right. And, watching this, and then by that time, the system had failed. And you knew something was wrong. So I'll give you another Oxford story. Because,
So they decided Bentham had won the debate with Blackstone, huh?
Yeah. Well, it turned out they believed the same thing. If you actually go back, both of them believed that the permanence of possession was one of the most critical issues. And
they meant in their method.
But they didn't even have different methods. Neither of them had a method.
Neither of them had a method.
But essentially, the Roman proposition that they had to debate was, how do you retain possession? And the Romans got the right answer to that question. We tell you how you acquire possession. We tell you how you lose possession, but we don't tell you how you keep possession, because you don't have to do anything to keep possession. Right. So essentially what happens is, if you put something in your house and go out and lock the door, it's not within your hands, but it's within your possession until somebody breaks in and takes the thing down. And so what they did is they solved the problem in that way, and both of them believed that you had to have that rule, because otherwise you couldn't put anything down and go out and hunt for anything else. It was a straight utilitarian justification. And you go back and you read the Roman text. They're not quite there, but they very much understand why it is that the stability of possession becomes critical, which is why possession is one of the great problems of the early common law, extremely often talked about in one facet or another. And of course, who is trained in Roman law? David Hume. He's a Scotsman, right?
Is that right? Oh, yeah. Right.
And he basically, the term that he uses when he talks about property is the stability of possession. Right. And he got it straight out of the Roman sources on which he relied. So that's...
we're almost out of time for this session. So just give us a few minutes and tell us what you said you came back from Oxford. Yeah. The universities had changed. What was your experience like at Yale?
Well, I was the only guy who knew common law in the whole place. And this was regarded as a kind of a demerit. Right. And I was not on the law review because that had been established. So I was always a kind of an outsider to that institution. And then I basically had to get into teaching. And a man named George Lefko comes through. George was very determined not to interview anybody, so he only put up a sign in the law review office. I signed it on the 11th. Tom Gray, whom you know, was number 10. Tom says, I got a job at Stanford already, so you take the interview. And God was kind to me.
So straight out of law school, you interviewed for...
Well, I was in my third year. And what happens is Lefko comes in. He was from Dartmouth. And it was supposed to be a 20-minute interview, and it lasted for 3 hours. Right. Because there was nobody behind me. And I kept chasing after George. And George kept chasing after me. And it was a brawl. And he just said, well, you're coming out, obviously, to interview. Then I went out there to interview. And essentially...
Out there being USC?
At USC. It's the only interview I had. UCLA had scheduled me and then said, you're too immature to matter. They probably were right. And so I did essentially a 13-hour stint, and it ended in a topless bar. Different environment and so forth, but it was just nonstop talk. Right. And that's my métier, right? There were no papers, no presentation. Dorothy Nelson asked me if I knew something about the freeway system. I said, well, Dorothy, I figured out what the basic organization was and then described the grid. And that kind of pleased her in some sense. And I can still remember Dorothy had a rare talent of putting her foot in her mouth when she meant well. So I'm just going to read one sentence from the acceptance letter that I got 3 days later. later. I'm out on a Thursday. On the Tuesday, I get the letter, and it says, "Dear Professor Epstein." That should have been a hint, right?
Yes, right.
But I didn't. And she opens it up and she says, "Dear Professor, I was so glad to meet you last week in Los Angeles. I regret." So, oh my God, that regret basically still sticks in my craw to this day.
Right.
Well, what do you regret? That I didn't have more time to spend with you. I mean, and then I got an offer, and off we went to USC. And at that point, it's my general academic development. As a transition, I will just say one thing. My late friend, dear friend, Michael Levine, and I went out to lunch the first day I got there with a man named Lou Brown. And Ronald and Michael talked about a man named Coase.
Named Coase.
And I said, oh, sounds interesting.
Perfect.
And Lou Brown said, look, it's important not to make errors. It's important to prevent them. And so as Christmas past and Christmas future, we're sitting at the same table on the same day.
Well, that sounds like a great place to stop with this episode, and we can pick up with part 2 and learn more about your early career at USC, and then moving to Chicago and your intellectual development from there. So,
okay.
So we'll look forward to part 2, the interview with Richard Epstein.